November 1944. The Hürtgen Forest, Germany. A young German soldier, 19 years old, his name is Otto Degen, crouches in a frozen foxhole carved into the muddy forest floor. His breath comes in short, ragged gasps, each exhalation creating small clouds of vapor in the freezing air. His hands shake uncontrollably, not just from the bone-chilling cold that has seeped into his very bones, but from sheer exhaustion, paralyzing fear, and 3 consecutive days without sleep. Around him, the forest is silent. But it's not the peaceful silence of nature. It's the kind of oppressive, suffocating silence that comes before violence and death. 50 meters away, though, in the dense fog and darkness, it could be 5 meters or 500 American soldiers wait in their own muddy foxholes. They're just as cold, just as terrified, just as young, and just as far from home. And above them both, the trees, ancient, towering pine trees that have stood for centuries, stand like silent, indifferent witnesses to what's about to happen. This isn't a battle for a strategically vital city like Stalingrad or Berlin. This isn't a fight for crucial oil fields or industrial centers that could change the course of the war. This is a battle for trees, for mud, for seemingly nothing at all. The Battle of Hürtgen Forest would last 3 brutal months from September 1944 to February 1945. It would kill or wound over 60,000 soldiers, American and German combined, making it one of the deadliest and longest battles fought by the US Army in World War II. It would achieve almost nothing of strategic value. And decades later, military historians and veterans alike would call it the battle that should never have been fought. But for Otto, for the American soldiers huddled in frozen positions across from him, for the thousands upon thousands of young men who would die screaming in these dark woods, none of that strategic analysis mattered. Because in war, you don't fight for grand strategy or geopolitical objectives. You fight to survive another hour, another day. You fight for the trembling soldier next to you. You fight because you've been ordered to, and you have absolutely no choice. This is their story. This is the story of the Hürtgen Forest. The Hürtgen Forest sits on the border between Belgium and Germany, southeast of the city of Aachen. It's approximately 50 square miles of dense, primeval woodland, thick pine and fir trees growing so close together that sunlight barely reaches the forest floor, steep ravines cutting through the landscape, narrow dirt trails that turn to impassable mud in rain, and almost no roads suitable for tanks or heavy military vehicles. Before the war, it was a place of natural beauty. Families hiked there. Hunters pursued deer and boar. It was peaceful, quiet, untouched. In the fall of 1944, this forest became the site of one of the longest, bloodiest, and most futile battles fought by the United States Army in all of world. War II. Why fight for a forest? That's the question military historians have been asking and struggling to answer satisfactorily for 80 years. In September 1944, the situation seemed clear. The Allies had successfully liberated France in the wake of D-Day. They were pushing aggressively into Germany. The Nazi war machine was crumbling. The war seemed almost won. Victory appeared within reach. But the Hürtgen Forest stood directly in the path of the Allied advance toward the Ruhr River dams, massive concrete structures that, if deliberately destroyed by retreating German forces, could flood the entire river valley and completely halt the Allied advance for weeks or even months. American commanders made a fateful decision: take the forest, secure it, eliminate the German defenders, control the approach to the dams. It was a decision that would cost tens of thousands of young lives. The terrain, nature as enemy. Imagine, if you can, trying to fight a modern war in terrain, specifically designed by nature to kill you. The Hürtgen Forest was an absolute nightmare for combat operations. Dense trees, pine, fir and spruce grew so thickly that they blocked out the sun even at midday, creating a perpetual twilight that disoriented soldiers and made navigation nearly impossible. Visibility was measured in feet, not yards. You couldn't see the enemy until he was almost on top of you. The forest floor was a treacherous maze of thick roots, deep mud that could swallow a man's boot, and undergrowth so dense that movement was slow, exhausting, and incredibly loud. Every step announced your position to the enemy. Tanks and armored vehicles, the backbone of American military superiority, got hopelessly stuck in the mud and between the trees. They became sitting targets, useless. And then there were the tree bursts, when artillery shells exploded in the treetops above, and they did. Constantly they sent deadly shrapnel and massive wooden splinters raining down on the soldiers below. These wounds were often more horrific and deadly than direct hits from shells. One American soldier, years later, would describe the Hürtgen Forest as a green hell where trees killed you as surely as bullets. Another said, his voice still shaking decades after the war, "The forest itself was our enemy as much as the Germans, maybe more. The Germans, prepared and determined. And the Germans defending the forest? They'd been preparing for this fight for weeks, maybe months. They built reinforced concrete bunkers camouflaged perfectly into the landscape. They dug deep, complex networks of trenches. They laid tens of thousands of anti-personnel and anti-tank mines. They positioned machine gun nests at every natural defensive position, every clearing, every trail junction. They knew every trail, every ravine, every line of sight, every weak point, and they were absolutely determined to make the Americans pay dearly in blood, in lives, in morale, for every single foot of muddy ground. The stage was set for slaughter. Otto Dagen is 19 years old, though the war has aged him far beyond his years. He's been in the Wehrmacht since he was barely 17, conscripted, trained hastily, and thrown into combat. He's fought in the brutal deserts of North Africa under Rommel. He's seen close friends die in his arms. He's learned to bury his fear so deep down inside that it can't paralyze him when the bullets start flying. But the Hürtgen Forest? This is different. This is worse than anything he's experienced. The new recruits. In early November 1944, Otto's depleted unit receives reinforcements, and he uses that word bitterly, sarcastically. These aren't hardened soldiers, they're boys. Some are barely 16 years old. They've received perhaps 6 weeks of hurried, inadequate training. They don't know how to properly dig a foxhole. They flinch at every sound. Their hands shake when they try to load their rifles. Otto looks at them and sees himself too, from years ago. Scared, naive, still believing the propaganda about defending the sacred fatherland and achieving glorious victory. Now he knows better. Now he knows the terrible truth. War isn't about glory or honor or noble causes. It's about staying alive for one more hour, one more day, one more week. It's about not dying in the mud thousands of miles from home. "Stay close to me," Otto tells one of the new boys, a pale, skinny kid named Emil Richter, who reminds Otto painfully of his younger brother back home. "Don't do anything stupid or heroic. And when the shelling starts, and it will start, get your face down in the dirt and pray to whatever God you believe in." Emil nods, trying desperately to look brave and confident. But Otto sees the raw, naked fear in the boy's eyes. He's seen that look before, many times. On the faces of soldiers who would be dead within days. The reality of Hürtgen life in the Hürtgen Forest isn't constant, dramatic battle after battle like in the propaganda films. It's long, agonizing stretches of cold, wet, terrifying waiting, punctuated by brief, chaotic moments of absolute violence and death. Soldiers spend days, sometimes weeks, huddled in muddy foxholes, soaked to the bone by cold rain, their feet slowly rotting from trench foot, trying desperately to stay warm with inadequate uniforms and almost no winter gear. Food is scarce, usually just watery soup and stale bread, if they're lucky. Medical supplies are even scarcer. Morphine for the wounded has run out. Hope is scarcest of all. At night, the forest comes alive with sounds that jolt soldiers from whatever fitful sleep they might manage. Branches snapping under weight, animals moving through undergrowth, or maybe enemy soldiers creeping closer through the darkness. No one really sleeps. Fear and cold keep you awake. And if you do somehow fall asleep, the nightmares wake you screaming. The first attack, it happens without any warning whatsoever. One moment, Otto and his squad are huddled in their muddy positions, passing around a single precious cigarette and trying desperately to stay warm in the freezing November rain. The next moment, the entire forest erupts into hell. American artillery, massive 105mm and 155mm howitzers positioned miles behind the lines, pounds their positions with devastating accuracy. Shells explode violently in the treetops above, sending deadly metal shrapnel and massive wooden splinters, some as long as a man's forearm, raining down on them like some medieval weapon from hell. Men scream. Blood sprays across the frozen ground, steaming in the cold air. Bodies are torn apart by the blasts. "Take cover! Return fire!" Otto shouts desperately, but his voice is completely swallowed by the overwhelming noise, the explosions, the screaming, the crack of splintering wood. Emil, the new recruit Otto has tried to protect, freezes completely. His rifle falls from his shaking, nerveless hands. His eyes are wide with absolute terror. Otto grabs him roughly, shakes him hard. "Shoot! Shoot back or you'll die! Do you understand me? You'll die!" The battle, if you can even call it that, lasts perhaps 20 minutes. When the shelling finally stops and the smoke begins to clear, 3 of Otto's squad are dead, their bodies torn apart beyond recognition. 5 more are wounded, some horribly. 1 man is screaming for his mother, clutching his shattered leg. Emil is still alive, miraculously untouched physically, but something fundamental in his eyes has changed forever. The innocence, the naivety, the belief that he might somehow survive this, it's all gone. He's no longer a boy playing at soldier. He's either a man now, or maybe just a survivor. Otto isn't sure there's a difference anymore. 50 meters across the forest, though neither side can see the other through the dense trees and fog, American soldiers face exactly the same frozen hell. Private Joseph Miller is 20 years old, from a small farm outside Toledo, Ohio. He enlisted eagerly in early 1943, filled with patriotic fervor and determination to fight the Nazis, end the war, and return home a hero. Now, after 2 brutal weeks in the Hürtgen Forest, he just wants to go home. That's all. Just home. To his mother's kitchen, to his father's farm, to normalcy. The worst place of any, that's what American soldiers called the Hürtgen Forest among themselves. One veteran, interviewed decades later, his hands still shaking from memories, said, "I've been to hell. I know what hell looks like. It was green and cold and wet, and it was called Hürtgen, the US. Army sent division after division into the forest, the 9th Infantry Division, the 28th Infantry Division, the 4th Infantry Division, the 8th Infantry Division. All took absolutely catastrophic casualties. Companies that entered the forest with 200 men came out, if they came out at all, with perhaps 50 or 60 survivors. Entire battalions were effectively wiped out, ceased to exist as fighting units. The casualty rates were worse than anything the US Army had experienced since the Civil War. The futility. And for what purpose? What did all that death accomplish? American forces would capture a small piece of ground one day, paying for it with dozens of lives, only to lose it the next day when German counterattacks drove them back. The Germans counterattacked relentlessly, throwing in their own reinforcements, often just as young and inexperienced as the American replacements. Every small gain was paid for in rivers of blood from both sides. By December 1944, after 3 full months of brutal, continuous fighting, the US Army had advanced barely 7 miles into the forest. 7 miles. 7 miles of blood-soaked mud, at a cost of over 33,000 American casualties, killed, wounded, missing, or driven insane. One American officer, surveying the carnage, called the Hürtgen Forest a green meat grinder that just keeps chewing up men. Another said, bluntly, bitterly, this was a battle that should never, ever have been fought. It was a mistake, a terrible, costly mistake. The human cost, Joseph Miller watches his friends die, one by one. He watches Private Danny Sullivan from Brooklyn lose both legs to a mine, screaming, begging for his mother as he bleeds out in the mud. He watches Sergeant Thomas Kovacs, who'd promised to teach Joseph to fish when they got home, take shrapnel to the face from a tree burst. There's no face left to recognize. He watches young men, boys, really. Some only 18 go completely mad from the constant shelling, the stress, the horror. They curl up in their foxholes, catatonic, unreachable. Some have to be carried out, some never recover. He writes letters home to his mother that he knows can never capture what this place is really like. Dear Mom, he writes by candlelight in his foxhole, hands shaking so badly he can barely hold the pen. I can't tell you what it's like here. I don't have the words, and even if I did, the censors would black them out. But please, please pray for me. Pray I make it home. That's all I want now. Just to come home. He never sends that letter. He tears it up. His mother doesn't need to know how scared he is. Wars are fought by soldiers, young men with rifles, terrified and far from home. But wars are decided, won or lost, by generals and politicians, older men, safe and comfortable, far from the bullets. And in the Hürtgen Forest, the generals catastrophically failed the soldiers they commanded. The strategic blunder. With the clarity of hindsight, with access to all the records and battle reports, military historians universally agree. The decision to attack through the Hürtgen Forest was a complete disaster, one of the worst tactical and strategic decisions made by Allied commanders in all of World War II. The forest negated every single advantage the Allies possessed. Air superiority? Useless. Planes couldn't see through the dense canopy, couldn't identify targets. Armored divisions? Useless. Tanks got stuck in the mud, trapped between trees. Artillery support? Limited effectiveness, and often as dangerous to American troops as to Germans because of the tree bursts. Fighting in the Hürtgen Forest reduced modern warfare to primitive, brutal World War I-style combat. Soldiers in trenches, fighting with rifles, grenades, and bayonets. Close quarters. Personal, deadly. But the generals kept sending men in to die. Why? Why continue an obviously failing strategy? Pride. Institutional stubbornness. The sunk cost fallacy, we've lost so many men already, we can't let those deaths be in vain. The belief that just one more push, one more attack, would finally break the German lines. But it never did. The German perspective. On the German side, commanders harbored no illusions. They knew they couldn't win. Germany was losing the war. That was obvious to anyone paying attention. But they could delay. They could make the Allies pay such a high price for every inch of German soil that perhaps, just perhaps, the Allies might sue for a negotiated peace rather than unconditional surrender. So they ordered their soldiers, men like Otto, boys like Emil, to fight to the last man, to the last bullet. And Otto, Emil, and thousands like them had absolutely no choice but to obey orders, even when those orders meant almost certain death. By the time the Battle of Hürtgen Forest officially ended in February 1945, 3 months of continuous combat, the statistics were absolutely staggering. American casualties. Approximately 33,000 soldiers killed, wounded, captured, or driven insane. Some estimates place the number as high as 55,000. German casualties. Approximately 28,000. Total casualties from both sides. Over 60,000 young men. 60,000 futures erased. 60,000 families destroyed. 60,000 graves, or worse, bodies, never recovered, lost forever in the mud and trees. And what was gained strategically? Almost nothing. The forest was eventually taken, yes, but by the time it finally fell to American forces, the strategic situation had completely shifted. The Ruhr dams, the original objective, were captured by a flanking maneuver that bypassed the forest entirely. All those deaths, all that suffering, for nothing. The Hürtgen Forest became a symbol, a terrible, haunting symbol of the futility and waste of war. The survivor's Otto survived the Hürtgen Forest, barely. By the time his unit was finally pulled out of the line in late January 1945, he'd lost most of his original squad. Emil, the boy he'd tried so hard to protect, to keep alive, died in a mortar attack just 2 weeks before the battle ended. A random shell. Wrong place, Wrong time. Dead instantly. Otto would carry that guilt, that failure, for the rest of his long life. Joseph Miller also survived, against all odds. He returned to Toledo, Ohio in the spring of 1946. His family threw a welcome home party. They called him a hero. They wanted to hear stories about the war. He couldn't tell them. He couldn't find the words to describe what he'd seen, what he'd done, what had been done to him. For the next 50 years, until his death in 1996, Joseph Miller would wake up at least once a week in cold sweats, hearing the sound of artillery shells exploding in treetops, hearing his friends screaming. He rarely spoke about the war. When pressed, when someone asked, he would only say quietly, "It was hell, pure hell, and I pray to God no one ever has to go through anything like that again." But his prayer went unanswered. Wars continue. Young men continue to die. We continue to repeat the same mistakes. Today, if you visit the Hürtgen Forest, you'll find it peaceful again. Trees have grown back. Hiking trails wind through the landscape. Families picnic in clearings. Birds sing. But if you look carefully, if you know where to look, you can still find remnants of that terrible battle. Old foxholes, slowly filling with leaves and earth. Rusted fragments of equipment half buried in the soil. Shell craters, now overgrown with ferns. And in some places, if you dig, you still find human remains soldiers never recovered, never identified, never brought home. Local Germans say that on quiet nights, especially in November when the fog rolls through the trees, you can still hear the ghosts of the battle. The sound of distant artillery, men shouting in English and German, screaming. Maybe they're right. Maybe the forest remembers. So here's the question we must ask ourselves. Was it worth it? Was 7 miles of forest worth 60,000 casualties? Was any piece of ground, any objective, worth the lives of so many young men who wanted nothing more than to go home? And here's the even harder question. Could it happen again? Is it happening now? Are we still willing to send young people to die for battles that serve no real strategic purpose? Are we still willing to follow leaders who make catastrophic decisions and never pay the price for those decisions themselves? Have we learned anything from the Hürtgen Forest? Or are we doomed to repeat the same mistakes, generation after generation, war after war? Tell us in the comments. Do you think the Battle of Hürtgen Forest should have been fought, or should commanders have found another way? What do you think about the generals who ordered wave after wave of attacks despite the horrific casualties? How do we honor the soldiers who fought and died there without glorifying the war itself? What lessons from Hürtgen have we learned? What lessons have we forgotten or ignored? If you're a veteran, or if someone in your family served in World War II, how does this story affect you? Share your thoughts. Share this video. Make sure this story isn't forgotten. Because if we don't remember, if we don't learn from history, we are absolutely doomed to repeat it. And the next time, it might be our sons, our daughters, our grandchildren dying in some godforsaken forest, fighting for nothing, dying for mistakes made by leaders who will never face consequences. Never forget the